All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about solid waste treatment. This is lecture set 30. We are still talking about the ways in which we use our resources. So we are still dealing with standard EU 5B, which talks about how human populations have to develop methods of containing and treating the waste they produce as their population grows. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to compare and contrast the types of wastes produced by human populations, identify the ways in which solid waste can be managed, including current and sustainable methods, identify the categories of hazardous waste and explain how hazardous wastes are managed, and identify and explain laws that are in place to regulate solid and hazardous waste. So the first thing that we have to do is talk about how do we define solid waste. So when we think about waste, we're typically thinking about the trash that is produced in our homes. So as you see here on the right side of your screen, lots of examples of trash. However, there are three basic types of solid waste that we talk about. So we describe it in terms of general solid waste, hazardous waste, and radioactive waste. So solid waste is what we typically know as trash or garbage. It's any unwanted material that is produced by human population's actions. And we categorize it based on where it comes from. So we have two types of solid waste. We have industrial waste, which comes from factories, and we have municipal waste, also known as MSW, municipal solid waste. That comes from homes and businesses that are not factory related. That's the typical trash that you think of. Then you have hazardous waste. These are substances that pose significant health hazards for humans. To be considered a hazardous waste, you have to fall into one or more of the following categories. You must be poisonous, dangerously chemically reactive, also known as being volatile, corrosive, or flammable. You must fall into one of those four categories. And within hazardous waste, the two most common types of hazardous waste are organic wastes, which are chemical compounds that are carbon-based. Typically, we're talking about pesticides there, for example, and heavy metal wastes, usually mercury, lead, and arsenic. The last category is going to be radioactive waste, which, interestingly enough, is not categorized as hazardous waste. Radioactive waste requires specific storage, and it is the byproduct of nuclear reactions in energy and weapon producing plants. So when we talk about municipal solid waste, here's kind of a breakdown of what we find in there. The largest percentage of municipal solid waste is paper and cardboard, followed by food waste, yard waste, plastics, metals, and then you have the miscellaneous, which includes kind of the other categories. So rubber, those kinds of things that don't typically fall into those major categories there. The majority of municipal solid waste, when we're talking about just general stuff that gets pumped out, is packaging, specifically plastic packaging. That's a big problem. So, of all of this, you'll see the largest category is paper and cardboard, which is recyclable. Then you have food waste and yard waste, some of which is compostable. Of this, only 24% of recyclable materials are actually recycled. So, municipal solid waste makes up 1.5% of the total waste produced in the US. Only 24% of what can be recycled actually is. So when we talk about dealing with municipal solid waste, there's a difference between what we should do and what we actually do. So if you see here, it talks about the desirability of something in terms of how energy efficient it's going to be, how clean it's going to be. So the largest things that we do up here at the top, this is called waste prevention. So we're talking about things that are going to prevent large amounts of waste from entering the system. And here we're going to talk about the 4 R's of your resources. So we're talking about refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. So you can simply refuse to use a material, use a product completely. You don't want it, you're not going to take it. You can reduce, which is just simply using less of a particular material. Reuse something, so once it's done its original function, you can repurpose it and use it for something else. Or you can recycle, which means that you're going to separate and return items that are broken down. There are 2 types of recycling. You have primary recycling and secondary recycling. Primary recycling turns that material into the same thing. So it takes an aluminum can and uses it to make another aluminum can. Secondary recycling occurs when you take something and it is used to produce another object. So you take a plastic bottle and it's used to produce the covering for your binder notebook. There are other things that we can do here with dealing with municipal solid waste. And we're talking about what's called integrated waste management. And integrated waste management is when we try to reduce the environmental impact of a waste without actually getting rid of it. So instead of using less waste, we're just trying to find a way to mitigate the impact. So there are 2 major things we can do with municipal solid waste. We can burn it, which is incineration. That's usually for things that cannot be recycled. There are lots of restrictions and air pollution methods that have to be taken care of when it comes to burning waste. The United States does about 9% of this. In a lot of European countries, that number is much higher. The more common thing to do in the United States is to bury something. So we're going to put it in a kind of landfill. That's 67% of our solid waste ends up in landfills. They're most commonly sanitary landfills, which contain liners and things such as clay and plastic foam to prevent water from getting into the waste and to prevent any water that does get in or any chemicals to come out. And this is actually called leachate. So Leachate. We want to try to prevent that from coming out of our landfills because some of it is contaminated. Sanitary landfills may also include tubes that can release and catch methane in order to use that to produce energy. The less common method is the open pit landfill. It's very rare in the US, but it is more common in lesser developed countries. That's where everything just gets dumped in one area and it does what it does. So how do we define hazardous waste? So hazardous waste is defined under this law called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. You'll see that listed at the end of the slides, so don't worry too much. It defines what it means to be reactive, poisonous, corrosive, flammable. So when you look at hazardous waste, you're looking for these symbols that will tell you that is something that's considered hazardous, and it has very specific methods of management. So when we manage hazardous waste, we're looking for one of 3 things. We either want to reduce the production of it, we want to convert it to something that is less hazardous, or we want to be able to store it in a safe and permanent manner. Here, this slide talks about the ways that we use to convert hazardous material to something that's not so hazardous. So you have physical, chemical, and biological methods. So physical methods are really just going to separate what's hazardous and what's not. Chemical is going to take that particular hazardous material and put it through a set of reactions or a set of processes to make it less hazardous or not hazardous at all. Common things that we're working on now is cyclodextrin treatment, which is a derivative of cornstarch that can be used to neutralize some hazardous materials. Biologically, you're looking to mimic a natural waste processing system. So you can use bioremediation, which is bacteria that are specifically designed to break down specific wastes. Or you can do phytoremediation, which is where a series of plants are able to filter a fluid and take in certain toxins in order to prevent them from moving any further in the ecosystem. So if we can't reduce the amount of hazardous waste that we have, if we can't convert it to a less hazardous material, or we've converted it but it still needs to be stored, there are a couple places that we can store that. Some hazardous waste areas have been designed as landfills. They function typically more like a sanitary landfill with a lot of liners, a lot of methods to reduce runoff to stop chemicals from getting out of the particular landfill that they're in. You also have surface impoundment. This typically tends to be lined ponds or pits that tend to not be very safe. They're very common to overflow in a heavy rain. They're also very common to leak. You also have deep well injection, which is where the particular waste is injected into the rock underneath an aquifer. You can also have areas where particular wastes are stored in abandoned salt mines or abandoned rock quarries, which is a lot easier to manage and a lot easier to regulate. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. All right, so there are a lot of laws that regulate solid waste. So there's a lot of information on these slides, so I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. You guys can write this down. So the big one is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the RCRA, also called RCRA. When you think of this, think cradle to grave. This law requires any producer of a chemical or a product to be responsible for anything that happens with it from the time it's produced to the time it is disposed of. You have the Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates and ensures safety of chemicals. Unfortunately, the EPA assumes something is safe until it is proven otherwise. You have the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This is CERCLA, also known as Superfund. It is designed to make polluters pay to clean up spills, problems. Unfortunately, Superfund is broke. They have no more money. So now the taxpayers are paying for this cleanup if there's not a way to catch the polluter. It also deals with brownfields, which are abandoned industrial or commercial sites. Last three, you have the Basel Convention, which is an international agreement that prevents the transport of hazardous materials through a country. You have the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, or POPs. This specifically addressed the dirty dozen, or 12 common pollutants that are known to bioaccumulate or biomagnify in the fatty tissues of a particular organism. And then you have the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which talks about disposal of radioactive waste. Please be familiar with the most common 12 of the dirty dozen, please. All right, so you should be able to do all of these things. Please forgive me for the long lecture, but this is very important that you understand this information. And we will take a look at it when we meet again.